So again, thanks for having me here. I am actually a Central Northeast Neighbors resident, so maybe some of your neighbors, but I'm here tonight to talk about the mixed-use zone project. I'm the project manager for that for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Terry heard this spiel a couple times. I think others have. Jim may have heard it at least once. David's heard it. So what we wanted to do is I wanted to give you a briefing on what the project is, what it's trying to do, and where it's aiming right now, because we're about midway through the project, and kind of bring you up to speed about where we are, and then answer your questions. I have a long presentation that I've tried to shorten, and I'm going to go through it really quick. What I'd like to do is go through it pretty quickly, and then answer your questions at the end of it if I can. So if you can kind of make mental notes about what you might be having questions about, that would be helpful. I've got two things that I can hand out you can take home and study, and also one you can follow along. The first one I'm going to hand out is what we're calling a mixed-use zone preliminary concept, and that preliminary concept, go ahead and pass the rest of them around. The preliminary concept is our first kind of exactly what it says, preliminary concept for how we might recast the mixed-use zones that we're working on in Portland. And this document was published in November, and it gives a lot more background about kind of a little bit of the background about why we're doing it and what some of our goals are and what we're trying to achieve. It's a little bit vague on the specific details. It's got what we're calling a conversion chart, a little bit more detail about that, but it's vague on the details of the zones. Yeah, but it's a good background document. We have taken that, and now we're getting into what we're calling the revised zoning concept. And I'll pass this document around for you to either follow along on my presentation or take home. So this one you can actually use while I'm talking, although the slides orders have changed a little bit. But this is fairly current, fairly accurate. So we're passing this around, and this is a PowerPoint that as I said, I'm presenting. And this was released in February, coincided with several public meetings we did about a revised zoning concept. And this one has a lot more details and flesh on the bone about what it is exactly we're proposing. So let me go ahead and dive into this. So before I launch into it, have you all had Nan Stark out here to talk about the comprehensive plan update and why the city is doing all of the work we're doing?
This lady right here.
Oh, there she is.
I've talked about it a few hundred times. Yeah.
A few hundred times. So everybody understands that we're updating our comprehensive plan. We're expecting 120 plus or minus 1,000 new households to move to Portland, which translates to roughly 200 to 240,000 new people, all within the city limits of Portland. And that we're expecting, an equal or a slightly greater number of new jobs to occur here. So we've got a pretty large population increase kind of on the horizon. Part of our challenge as planners is trying to figure out how we're going to accommodate all those 200 some odd thousand people and all those jobs, and where do they go? And as well as how do they get around, and how do we serve with infrastructure and all of that other stuff. But the mixed-use zone project is focused really on the part that is looking at how do we accommodate where they're going to live, and how do we accommodate where jobs can be located. So it's part of comprehensive plan update. It's part of the implementation of it. It's trying to implement some aspects of our comprehensive plan which focus on trying to create more complete neighborhoods, complete walkable, easily accessible neighborhoods, and create robust job growth in the city, both downtown and in our industrial areas, but also in our neighborhood and commercial areas. So that's the piece of the comprehensive plan, or a key piece of it this is implementing. As I said, we're expecting about 200,000 new people, 120,000 households. About half of that new growth is expected to happen in Portland's mixed-use areas. And I'll tell you what those are if Nan hasn't gone over that in a lot of detail, but I'll show you what that means graphically. But these are mostly in areas along our main streets, our Sandy Boulevards, our Fremonts, part of Fremonts, our Division, Hawthorne, Belmonts, out in East Portland it's Division, and North Portland it's Lombard. So it's our major commercial streets are our mixed-use areas, and our centers are places like Hollywood, or the Lentz kind of area right around 92nd and Foster, or the St. John's kind of downtown area. and some other ones that we are proposing fit those kind of criteria for the new conference fund. But that's where this growth is going to occur. The other 50% of the growth is expected to occur downtown, about 30% of it downtown, and about 20% of it sprinkled throughout residential neighborhoods throughout Portland. And a big reason that we're focusing on the mixed-use areas in downtown is to minimize the amount of change that happens in those residential neighborhoods, in the R5 areas with the single-family houses, so that we don't expect to see as much change in those areas as might be warranted otherwise. So this project is focusing on our commercial zones that are applied in those areas. We have 8 or 9 of them. I'm losing track of it now. They were written back in the early 90s or late 80s when our economy, this is Belleville and economy, and our kind of land use pattern was a little bit different than it is today. We were more auto dependent. At that point in time, we were coming off of a 1959 comprehensive plan into the 1980 comprehensive plan. It was moving away from an auto kind of oriented plan into a more pedestrian oriented plan, but we were still kind of in that transition period a little bit. So the zones that we had starting in the 80s were moving away from the auto-oriented land use pattern, but not fully away. And I think we're seeing an increasing trend towards moving away from that where we can. So we're really looking at these zones to figure out how do they deal with that, move forward in a less auto-centric or auto-dominated economy moving forward, and how do they accommodate this new growth and development in a way that's still sensitive to neighborhoods and dealing with other things. And the final thing is, so we're creating these new commercial mixed-use zones that will replace the existing set of 9 zones that will be applied virtually everywhere that there's commercial zoning now outside of the central city. The central city's on its own plan, and so is Gateway. The Gateway's not having a plan done, but the central city and Gateway use the same zones. And they're revising them for the central city, and I think they'll probably revise them for Gateway as well. But we're not touching the central city for sure. Gateway's a little bit up in the air. So where are these centers and corridors? This is the map that shows those. I won't go over this in detail, but here's Sandy Boulevard, as you well know. Here's Hollywood. So the way this is set up, it's a series of dots and lines. The dots are centers in various in various sizes. So Hollywood is designated by Metro as a town center, and we think of it as a town center as well. And as is, St. John's up here and Lansdowne here. And these are connected by a series of these red lines, which we're calling civic corridors, which are our main arterials in Portland. Those are places where we think, with some good public and private investment, those could become much better places for development as well as maintaining, getting around the city. And then there's a series of smaller dots here that are the neighborhood centers. And those are thought to be smaller scale kind of areas where you might have community services aggregated, so that you might have some shopping areas and whatnot in these center areas. Try to focus some of that activity there so that it creates a sense of place. And those are connected by these other lines, these orange lines, which we're calling neighborhood corridors, which are smaller scale than civic corridors. So that's kind of the framework, is that we want to grow in these kinds of places, these dots and lines on the map. It manifests itself a little differently in the zoning, but that's the basic idea. Some of the objectives of our mixed-use project are written up here. I mentioned we want to implement the comp plan, but we're trying to look at building scale, transitions to residential neighborhoods, areas where we might require retail or community services, so that we try to build that, more pedestrian, walkable, convenient neighborhood. We want to consider, how these zones apply different design standards and different designs in different contexts, including addressing some historic and local characteristics. We want to make sure that the development that we're allowing in these areas is feasible, so that we don't set new zoning regulations that preclude development so that nothing happens over the next 20 years, because that would be a failure in our ability to accommodate the growth, and it's going to force it somewhere else, which is not the goal of the city's plan. We want to make sure that we plan for housing, and that we want to try to see if we can plan for a housing program that's affordable for a greater group of Portlanders, and making sure that we maintain opportunities for the commercial. And Nan's probably talked about this in the past. We have the Portland plan, which was recently adopted, really places an emphasis on equity. So as we start to develop these codes, we're always thinking about what are the equity implications of this. And we try to make sure that we understand, even if we can't always address and equalize those equity implications, at least understand how different groups are affected by whatever we do. What it doesn't address is parking issues. There's been a lot of discussion about that over the last 2 years, parking for mixed-use zones and apartments without parking. There is a separate parking study going on with the Office of Transportation right now that's looking at how do we manage this future growth in these areas through on-street, demand management, and other things. As you go down the list, changes to our zoning code to require parking for some more developments is on their list, but it's down the list a ways. We're not doing anything with the central city. That's on a separate track. We're not looking at the design review system, which is kind of on its own track, scheduled for a later date. And some of the zones that we're talking about will have design review. Some of them won't. Most of them won't. But that's a completely separate kind of track that we're moving on. And then it's not addition. I heard a lot of discussion with the I can't remember what it's called, but it's the issue of the large houses in neighborhoods and change there. This isn't dealing with that at all, but that is on our planning horizon in the not too distant future. So this is not looking at any of the residentially zoned areas, only the commercially zoned areas. Just a quick shot of our timeline. We're in the concept development phase. We released a research and assessment report back in October. It recommended consolidating our 9 zones into a smaller set of zones with a number of different new development approaches, design and development standards to kind of address a number of issues. We'll talk about those in detail. And what we're trying to do is consolidate that all into a concept report that we aimed to release in March of 2015 after aiming to release it in January of 2015 and then aiming to release it in February. And now we're aiming to release it in April of 2015, but it is, I promise, on the way. And that will be the springboard for writing new zoning codes, which we hope to have out in late spring, May or June. And the idea is that we'd be aiming at taking this set of new zoning to the Planning and Sustainability Commission in summer sometime. Right now our hearing tentatively is scheduled in July. We've got 3 hearing dates starting in early July, extending to early August. That could get pushed back if our timeline slips at all, but that's the idea. And the idea overall, which isn't really expressed here in this diagram, is that as the comprehensive plan is moving through Planning Commission, it's going through right now. Our zoning code project is following that, and it will go to Planning Commission, and then the comprehensive plan and the zoning will ultimately advance to council later this year, and then ultimately get adopted. My understanding is all as one package, but probably through a series of separate hearings on those different things. A lot of questions come up about the zoning map, and I want to distinguish here now that we're dealing primarily with the zoning code regulations. It has implications for the zoning map. It will change the zoning map. This project will have what I'm going to call a conversion chart map, but that will be also modified through the district liaisons process. So there's a mapping process that also coincides with this as well. So what are the assessment recommendations? As I said, it recommended basically consolidating our 9 or so zones into a framework of fewer zones to simplify the code a little bit. We thought we had some redundancies that we could eliminate. And then we wanted to explore and test approaches to new design and development regulations that were kind of identified through the comprehensive plan process, through conversations with communities on neighborhood walks, through conversations with the development community, through conversations with the business community. And some of those we'll be talking about tonight. So what's in the revised zoning concept? I'm going to walk through the framework for the new zones and some of the development parameters that are changing. And then we'll talk about those design and development standards. Is everybody at this table pretty familiar with our set of existing commercial zones, the neighborhood commercial zones? If you're not, let me just walk through really quickly. We have neighborhood commercial zones that are small scale, that are applied in locations, generally isolated locations, or in areas within neighborhood context, or in areas where we don't expect a lot of development. And they are the CN1 and CN2 zones. And so you might see a CN1 zone in the middle of a residential neighborhood. If you had an old storefront that happened to be plopped in the middle of a residential neighborhood, that would probably be zone CN1. A 7-Eleven on a corner, or it used to be called a plaid pantry zone, people thought of it, right, would be a CN2 zone. Sometimes it'd be a small supermarket. So I think the area around Halsey and 67th, right outside the Rose City Village, that little shopping area there that's right behind the village and the I can't think of the name of the condo complex there. It might be zone CN2. Binford, yeah. That might be zone CN2. So those are the neighborhood scale zones. So they currently allow about 3 stories of development maximum. I'm talking about, whenever I say this, when I say they allow, I'm talking about the maximum. 3 stories of development, about 30 feet of height. Then we have what I would call our medium-sized zones, our storefront commercial, which is widely applied in places like Hollywood, on Lower Sandy Boulevard, Division Hawthorne Belmont, throughout Sellwood, in parts of St. John's. It's more of a pedestrian-oriented commercial zone. It's about a 4-story scale maximum height. It's also applied on places on, I think, on Fremont as well. 4-story scale maximum height, and we also have a general commercial zone, another medium-sized zone. It's a 4-story scale zone, but it's much more auto-oriented. So you got a lot more drive-throughs and Jiffy Lubes and things like that that would be allowed in that zone. And then we have a couple of big scale zones. Our currently central employment, which is the EX zone. I don't think we have any of it out in this part of the neck of the woods. And then the CX zone, which is the central commercial zone. We have some of that applied in Hollywood, and that's our largest scale zone in our current framework. Those allow 6-story buildings and 6-story plus. The EX is a 6-story base, and then plan districts or other regulations would modify that to allow more. The CX is 7-story base, and plan districts and other regulations allow more. So that's kind of the framework we have now, and that's the one that we're shifting and altering. And so what we're proposing is to collapse all of those different zones into 4. A small scale zone called Commercial Mixed Use 1. I wouldn't pay a lot of attention to the use allowances here because this is a very abbreviated version, but it will allow a variety of uses, including residential and commercial and some light industrial type uses, employment uses. We're consolidating the general commercial and the commercial storefront and some of the general commercial, I should say, not all of it, around a medium-sized one called Commercial Mixed Use 2. We want to consolidate the large ones, the EX and the CX, around one zone called the Commercial Mixed Use 3. And then we will keep a general commercial-like zone called, we'll probably call it commercial employment, but it might still be called general commercial, keeping that. So going from 9 zones into 4, because we don't think we need so much redundancy in the small ones. A big change in our proposal, before I get into the scale of these, is the way we're approaching development in these zones. Currently, our commercial zones, as you probably see around town, allow a lot of housing to be developed. Our commercial zones have a lot of housing for, I don't know, Nan, since 1924, when the zoning code was written, something like that. They've always allowed housing. The market hasn't always built housing in those zones, but they've always allowed it. Currently, the zones are set up in a way that they build in floor area ratios, which is the amount of building area you can build on a particular site. And they set that level for non-residential development. And then they allow residential development above and beyond that to the height and the extent of the setbacks allowed in the zone. So the best example I can give you is probably in a neighborhood commercial zone, small scale zone. In the neighborhood commercial 1 zone, the floor area ratio is 0.751. So if you had a 10,000 square foot lot, you could build 7,500 square feet of building area for non-residential use. But you could build residential up to the 30-foot height limit and up to the setbacks in the zone, up to the site limits of the zone. So the effective floor area ratio, if you look at residential on that site, is about 2.5 to 1. So part of what we're doing is trying to encapsulate residential in the calculations for floor area so we can better regulate that. Right now, it's kind of a wild card. You can build as much as you want beyond the floor area ratio. And we're trying to also meet some other comprehensive plan objectives by building in some performance bonuses for what we're calling public benefits. And those performance bonuses for public benefits are really around the comprehensive plan's kind of public policy goals for the most part. They're around providing affordable housing, trying to provide affordable commercial space, and then some other kind of localized amenities such as maybe locally accessible plazas in the development, or maybe some other kind of community benefit that might be available in development, or enhanced kind of landscaping or stormwater landscaping, or potentially some other issues around development. So we're trying to structure a bonus that tries to evoke some of these public goods as part of the private development process. And when we talk to the community members, what we heard kind of represented in this chart, if you can imagine this dotted line being the allowed amount of development in any given zone, and it varies depending on one. Some of the lines really down here and some of the lines higher. But let's just say the medium zone. So if you can imagine that's the allowed development. When we talked to the community, a lot of community members, not everybody, but a lot of them, they said, we're getting too much development and we're getting no benefit back out of it. So you should lower the level of development and only let them build what they can build now if they perform in some ways, whether they're supporting affordable housing or they're doing a plaza or some other kind of community benefit. We talked to the development community, we talked to other stakeholders, growth advocates in the community, and they said, we're finally seeing the development that Portland has anticipated for 25 years. So why would we want to stop that now? We shouldn't change the development allowances. We should, if you want to have community benefits like affordable housing and things like that, you should offer more development potential so that somebody would be incentivized to do that. And so we are in the process of exploring how we can make the most people net by looking at something that's kind of a hybrid. That joke didn't go over with you guys. But we're looking at a hybrid approach. So our approach we want to explore is suggesting that we do need to reduce the base level of allowed development. But in order to evoke that bonus, we want to allow back up and potentially above. So it's kind of a blend of these two things. And that's what we've been modeling in terms of our new regulations.
Barry, are you looking at affordable housing as some kind of a program that can be mandated because everybody skipped over it so far in the last few years?
Well, and I want to save some questions, but affordable housing is being discussed in Salem as something that could be mandated. We're looking at kind of a way that we could incentivize it or require it more. We would never require it through this approach that I'm talking about. It would be an incentive, and you would do it because there's an economic benefit to doing it as a developer. Essentially, that's the bottom line. We're trying to set a system that would make it as attractive to include some affordable housing as it would be to just do development that you would do by right. Yeah.
So, how do you do affordable housing on land that costs over $3 million an acre, like it does in Northeast Portland?
Yeah, well, we're working on that. I don't know the answer to that. But
Yeah,
I can show you what.
There is no answer. It's the answer, and it's because your policies have made land unaffordable to most Portlanders.
Well, and if you bear with me on
Yes.
this presentation, I think we're talking about, and part of the reason that land has become unaffordable, it's not entirely because of planning programs. Part of it is, there's an attractiveness to living in certain locations. There's land development. There is something to be said about the amount of development that's allowed on a land that drives a certain return and allows developers to bid properties to a certain level. So we're looking at all of those kinds of issues as we look into this.
But you forgot the restrictions applied due to the policy.
And if you want to talk about the urban growth boundary, that's another conversation, a bigger conversation to have about that, yeah.
So we're gonna, as you said, because you're leading this presentation, that you're taking questions after your presentation?
I'd prefer to do that, but let's walk through a few more of
Okay,
these
let's
things.
do
Yeah.
that.
So, does this thing work?
It will not advance this touch.
Okay, well then I'll just sit here. So I mentioned we've got 4 size zones. Those are some illustrations, and this is helpful to look at. I will use my finger here to say. So in the small zone, we're still talking about a 3-story kind of development envelope. We're talking about a 35-foot height limit in that zone, which is essentially 3 stories. And this shows the base level of development and what you would get with a bonus. So we're talking about lowering the base floor area ratio in this, and including residential in that level. And we started off with a 1-to-1, and in the smallest zone, we're still saying, even with a bonus, you can only go 3 stories, but you could get a lot more floor area, so you could fill up the box more. You could build a bigger box, you just couldn't build a much taller box. In the medium-sized zone, currently, which has a 4-story allowance, we said at the base level, you could still build 4 stories. We're not going to change that. We're starting off, we started modeling a base FAR that was 2-to-1, which is about 60% of what is allowed right now. Maybe not quite 60%. But we said with bonuses, and particularly maybe with an affordable housing bonus, you might be able to go to 5 stories in this zone, and it will give you more floor area to fill up that volume. In the largest zone, we're starting off, we're saying, that 6 stories is the base level height, and that's consistent with our current EX zone. The floor area ratio is 3:1, which is also consistent with our BX zone. But with bonuses, you could go up to 75 feet of height, which is what our CX zone allows. So it's the same as our existing zoning. And you can have more floor area to fill that up. And then our commercial employment zone would stay around the 3 or 4 story scale with lower floor area ratios. I mean, this is a zone here that we're not thinking we're going to try to incentivize housing. We would still allow it because we currently allow it, but we wouldn't provide bonuses to try to provide more that are affordable housing in that zone. So that's one we would probably hold more as a commercial zone that wouldn't incentivize housing. So that's kind of the way the structure is set up. And then we have, like I said, several different bonuses that we're trying to explore. Affordable housing being the highest priority for the city, frankly, right at the moment, but several others. Perfect. Thanks very much. And you can look through your presentation and kind of look at these. We're still sorting out how this would all get applied, but we're working on some aspects of it. We're also talking about creating another overlay zone that would be applied in 3 areas that would, around those centers, that would limit or prohibit drive-through developments and Jiffy Lube type development, require active ground floor space so that we encourage commercial uses at the ground floor rather than residential in some key areas. Enhancing ground floor windows, so we're talking about increasing window glazing at the ground floor, and then requiring potentially minimum floor areas in these key areas. Nan may have talked about this already, but I'll just mention this briefly, that our comp plan right now has a 1-to-1 almost relationship between our zoning and our comprehensive plan, where if you're in a general commercial comprehensive plan, you get a general commercial zone, or if you're in a commercial storefront kind of comprehensive plan, you get a commercial storefront zone, and there's not a lot of variance. We're going to a one-to-many relationship now, where it's arranged around a spatial hierarchy. You know, the more intense zones are closer into town, and you get less intense the farther away you get or more isolated you get. But what it means is we end up with some plan designations like mixed-use urban center. Think about places like Hollywood, Inner Sandy, or some of the really close-in inner main streets. They would be in that center. They could have one of 4 of these zones. They could have a really small-scale zone because maybe it's on the fringe. You think about a place like the north side of Tillamook Street. We don't have really big zoning there. On the south side, we do, because you're seeing the library and those apartment buildings there. But the north side, you have small scale, But in central Hollywood, you might also have, this big zone, or you might have the auto zone where the gas station is. So you'd have a variety. So I guess what I'm showing you here is that we're changing our relationship. And what that means is that we're developing, as part of this process, new criteria for how and where those zones would be applied, and how they would be administered in a quasi-judicial land use review. So if somebody came in and said, I want my zone changed because it's allowed in the plan from the medium zone to the big zone or the little zone to the big zone, we have to have some criteria for when we can say yes or not to that. Right now the criteria are, is there police and fire services available? Well, we know the answer to that question. Yes, there are. So we need to have more specific locational criteria. I'm being a little bit facetious, but it's a pretty limited set of criteria you can always check the box on for the most part. But so we want to develop locational criteria that says, you're not going to go from the little zone to the big zone unless you buy a light rail station where you've got some other attribute that would make it logically work in that area. So those are in your handouts there. So I mentioned where those are applied. Those are the inner ring neighborhoods, and so those are likely to get the mixed-use urban center. So that includes Hollywood all the way down, Belmont, Hawthorne, Division, Powell, inner northwest Portland, and then the town centers like places like St. John's, Lentz. 122nd and Division is actually identified as a town center. And then we have civic corridors, that's like Outer Sandy, 82nd Avenue, Outer Powell. We have mixed-use neighborhood areas, that's like Alberta or Cully. And then we have what we're calling dispersed sites, and those are those little one-offs, like the neighborhood grocery store or something like that. So this is a new framework. So the mixed-use zones project is looking at things at a broad base level, as I said earlier. What's the map implication of this? This project will create a conversion table. I've got a version of it up here that we had in our initial plan, or in our initial proposal, which you have. It shows how you would convert, what your zone would be coming out of this project without any other further review. So what we'll do is publish a map based on some kind of a conversion table here, and that will be kind of like a discussion draft or preliminary map. And then Nan and her group of district liaisons will look at that and do some fine tuning to that where they think we might have not got the right solution out of this. I think we'll get 80% or 90% of the properties will end up with the right zone through a conversion table, but it's not going to work for 100% of the properties. But how does this work? If you're in Hollywood, and that's a mixed-use urban center, and your zone is currently commercial storefront, like it is on Sandy, you're probably going to get the medium-sized zone, the CM2. But if you're in Hollywood, and your zone is currently CX, which it is like by the light rail station, your zone is going to be CM3 at the end of the day here. What it does is this conversion table tries to match the new zone as close as possible within reason with the existing zone. It doesn't say we're going to wildly up zone places, nor are we going to wildly down zone places. We're trying to keep on par. The DLs may make some adjustments to that, but that's kind of the approach of this conversion table. It's not trying to make massive changes to the zoning just for the sake of having a new plan.
And how will that be out?
That's going to be out, I expect the initial map of this to be out probably in May with the discussion draft of this.
Okay.
And will there be like a map app on that too?
That's a good question. Yeah. Probably, yeah, probably. So we modeled a few of these zones. I wanted to show you the scale that these produced at our initial modeling. We are probably going to change. I'll tell you, we're in the process of re-reviewing those floor area ratios. Our initial take on these, feedback from the development committee, feedback from our 26-member advisory group, which includes neighbors and developers and architects and business people, and feedback from the community in large, or not all the community, but a lot of the community, was that the floor area ratios that we prescribed to start off with are too low. They don't give enough development right out of the box. So they were encouraging us to look at more development capacity, because what happens when you set the floor area ratios too low is that nothing happens. There is not enough value in the development to incentivize new development. So we had to get the values up enough to really incentivize new development in these mixed-use scenarios to really kind of make them viable. So I want to show you, though, the scale of, we're not talking about doubling them or anything like that, but we are talking about incrementally increasing them. But I'll show you the scales they produce. So in the small scale zone, without a bonus, if you didn't want to do anything, jump through any hoops as a developer, you could do basically a 2-story on a 10, these are shown on 10,000 square foot lot, 2-story covering about half the lot. And that would be without a bonus. You're not doing anything special. Our revised proposal might be a little bit bigger than that. And then with the bonus, you could do something like this. So it's much more significant. This includes some tuck under parking in this particular model. It wouldn't have to at this unit count. But our architects that modeled this, we asked them to model what they thought the market would produce. So this is what that would be. The medium scale zone would be about a 2-to-1 FAR. We're thinking about moving that up to 2.25 or maybe 2.5. So expect a little bigger than this. But it really produced a 3-story building by right in that zone. This one shows some tuck under parking. And that would be without bonuses. If you invoked a bonus, it grows to about 4 or 5 stories, depending on how they lay it out. This one, again, shows some tuck under parking. We've gotten rid of some of these staired step backs, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that's kind of the scale with bonuses that you would get. The big zone, I'm sorry, that's just another version of that medium scale shown differently with a different step back in the front. In the large zone, the 3-to-1 FAR, floor area ratio, produces about a 4-story building by right. And then if you step up to the bonuses, you can get 6 or 7 stories and a pretty significant scale building. Now this is what you would see around the light rail station in Hollywood. Zoning allows that right now, or along Interstate Avenue is a place that allows this kind of scale of development now, or some places in Northwest Portland. So this is the largest kind of places. So we also, I mentioned, we know some of this economically. I won't go into the details of this because this is an evolving thing, but the thing we were looking for was, we were looking at how does that extra floor area, we tested it on affordable housing. We asked how much does the extra floor area return for a developer? Because there's got to be an incentive to do it, right? And what's the cost of providing that? What's the discount you have to do for the affordable housing? And what we found, these are hard to read charts, but what he found is that at 60% median family income, the cost of providing affordable housing outweighs most of the benefit that you get unless you get a low-income housing tax credit or you get a tax abatement. But that purple zone is the value of the floor area, so that is not equal to that, that's less. So our challenge was to figure out a way to make that and that more equitable, and we're working on that right now, because we don't want to rely on using tax abatements and low-income housing tax credits to make this project work.
Are those labels dollars per unit or what?
No. And Jim, I would have to get back to you and let you know exactly how that scale is set up, because I clipped this out of a presentation that Jerry. I'm just trying to show you order of magnitude stuff here, really, at this point in time. So we found that was really difficult. At 80% median family income, which is not as a deep a level of affordability, if we want to provide less affordability, it got a lot closer that the cost and the benefit kind of weighed out. If you apply the tax abatement, obviously it makes it much more attractive, but again, we're trying to avoid needing to have that. And
What
then,
are you using as the median family income?
I just heard a long discussion about that today. I think the median family income for a family of 4 right now is like $69,000, and 60% of that is $42,000. So,
a little higher than that. I heard on the family company and I was stunned.
yeah. So a lot of people don't make that kind of money.
And not even half.
Yeah. So affordable housing is kind of a big deal for a lot of people. And when people say affordable housing, people freak out, but it's just people, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that aren't, that are at that level. They're just our neighbors, they're just part of our community, right? So it's really providing affordable housing for a moderate income group. It's not high-end housing. In outer neighborhoods, the development economics don't work so well because the rents are not high enough to support increased floor area. The floor area doesn't have a lot of value. So when I showed you that list of bonuses, we also talked about affordable commercial space, and this would be somehow a developer would discount that commercial space so that they're not always renting to credit tenants. It's not always Walgreens and Subway and those kinds of, trying to discount it enough that a small local could be in there. We haven't figured out the mechanism for that yet, but that's what the idea behind this is. And we would give more floor area. If you weren't using the affordable housing, you could buy back some floor area by providing affordable commercial. Another option we were looking at was historic preservation. When we went on our walks, a lot of folks said, we value these 1- and 2-story, classic brick or, concrete commercial buildings. We don't want to see them go away. Is there a way to preserve them? Well, Oregon has really weak historic preservation laws. So we were looking for a market way to do that. So we said that you could transfer the development potential on one of those historic sites to a new development, and that way the owner of the smaller preserved development would give away their right to develop the larger project. They would sell their floor area essentially to a new development. So that's the way we would work that. A lot of details to be worked out about how far away could you transfer and what that means, but the idea would be to try to say, well, that building is in perpetuity going to be preserved, and the development right, the 1 or 2 stories that could have been here is going on this building over here instead. You can do that downtown. You can do that right now citywide, but since we can't regulate the floor area for residential, it effectively doesn't work outside of downtown. So what are we trying to do in terms of design and development stuff? We are looking at relating better building height to street scale and function. So there's been some recent change to this, so I'm going to give you the old version and the new version. So this is the old version first. So we're looking at, this is an example of the medium scale zone, and we said that because on our narrowest rights of way, the 60-foot rights of way, that maybe the 4-story scale or the 5-story building is not as appropriate as it would be in a large right of way like Sandy Boulevard. If you put a 4-story building on Sandy Boulevard, it's not too impactful because it's a big wide street, at least in visually, And I'm not talking about the area that transitions to the residential area, because I got another solution for that. We're just talking about the area on the main street. But on the narrower wide of way, it's more impactful because it's narrower street. So we suggested that on narrow rights of way, 60 feet, this is probably streets, like, I don't know how wide Fremont is, but I know Division, Belmont, Alberta, those are the kind of streets this would apply on, that you could only go to 3 stories of the street wall. If you wanted to build a 4th story, or maybe if you ever got a bonus for a 5th, you'd have to step it back a bit. You couldn't build 4 stories of the street wall. If you had the larger right-of-way, you could build straight up, which is what you could do now. And we said that in a case where you wanted to set your building back more, you could still build straight up because you're effectively creating a wider right-of-way. We're actually changing, in the process of changing our proposal on that, and I'll explain that in a minute. I think we're not going to require that, but we'd be happy to get your feedback on it. And in the bigger zone, we're saying similarly, if you're on a narrow right-of-way, like Williams, or maybe Belmont, Hawthorne Division, any of those small, not Hawthorne, Belmont Division, Alberta, you can only go 4-story street wall, but if you have the big zone applied there, you'd have to step back the upper floors. If you're on a big right-of-way like MLK or Sandy, you can do your 6-story building there without having to step it back. So that's one topic. Second topic we're looking at is trying to increase ground floor active uses and roof line variety by providing a little bit more height flexibility. Right now, all of our height limits are set at like 45 feet, 35 feet, 55 feet. And what happens is a developer will build a 12 to 15 foot ground floor, and then they put 3 floors of 10-foot floor to ceiling things, and they cap it at 45, and they just build a hard line across there, and you end up with things that look just very uniform. And if you go down Division Street, you'll see that, just a very uniform, kind of building line. And we heard a lot from our neighborhood walks that people don't like that uniformity. They'd like to have more variety in building size. Now, be mindful that not every building is going to redevelop, so you're going to have variety from that perspective. But they also said that they'd like to have more variety to allow some differences. So we're proposing to add an additional 3 feet of height. So instead of 35, 45, 55, you could go 38, 48, 58 if you're doing an active ground floor. So if you're building a commercial space of the ground floor, and it's going to be a high quality commercial space with high ceilings, you have a little bit more flexibility. You don't get another floor, but you get a little more flexibility. We're also talking about on corner sites of civic corridors, so that would be 82nd and Division is a good example of that, or
82nd and Sandy.
82nd and Sandy, potentially allowing us to notch out the corner of the building so that we don't bring the building right to the corner, and allow that space to be recaptured and a little bit more height on the end of it. And the idea there is that you don't cram the pedestrians so tightly in that corner space. So you give a little more breathing room on the corners there. That's kind of counter to one of our current policies about trying to reinforce corners with more building height. So we're trying to reconcile that, but that's something we're exploring.
Barry, would you allow some bonus of some kind for leaving that corner cut out, if you will?
Well, that would be that.
And some design issue on that corner, so it isn't just a paved area.
Yeah, we're sorting through that
for some return on it,
We're trying to figure this out because it's kind of like providing it's a privately owned public space. You're giving away some of your land area, for this purpose. What do you get back in return? When we're talking about plazas on site, smaller plazas, we're suggesting that if it's, within the FAR limits, you don't get anything back. But if you're kind of maxing out your FAR, and you provide a plaza, you get some return. It's probably like a 5 to 1. Because you're giving up 4 or 5 floors of development area to provide this open space, so you probably get that space back on the top. We're not sure exactly what the equation is here yet, but we're trying to figure it out.
You could maybe add a little class to your development by in that corner there, like putting a small fountain, for example.
Yeah. We haven't figured out exactly what the components of those plaza spaces are yet, but lots of different options. I want to talk. This is always an issue with neighborhood folks, so I want to make sure we're clear about this. We're talking about improving the way we transition on the rear side of properties, and people are probably going to say, this is an improvement, but it really is an improvement over on what we have in our existing code. So right now, development, if you're adjacent, this is a residential zone, if you're adjacent to a residential zone, if you see that red line there, that's kind of the current setback line. Not very much, about 14 feet total setback from here, and you go straight up. So what we're saying is that if you're within 25 feet of a residential zone, the maximum height that you can go here is about the same as the maximum height limit of residential zone. Not the same height as the house, but the same limit as is allowed here, which is essentially about 3 stories. So we're saying for a commercial development that adjoins a residential development like this, at 3 stories, you'd have to step the building back before you could go to a 4th story or more. So that's the idea behind this, is having a residential, a step down for the residential. And this is an illustration of how that works on Division Street, where they have this current code. In most other parts of town, you can put the code at 4 stories right to here. So we're going to propose that. We're saying in bigger zones, multifamily zones, we do the same thing in the medium-sized multifamily zone. So if that was a small apartment zone, we'd still make you step back at the 4th floor. And if you're adjacent to a big zone, like in Hollywood, you have big zone next to big zone, there's not going to be a step back there. We would still allow 1-story commercial buildings to be built to the edge of the property lines. That's not a change from what we have now. This is one I want to talk about and connect it back to that height transition on the main street. So we're going to require, because we can't apply design review everywhere, we want to apply what we're calling building articulation and massing standards that would reduce the appearance of bulk in new buildings. So these are 2 examples of buildings that we heard from the community for the medium-sized zones actually worked pretty well. And why do they work well? It's because, for instance, this one steps back that 4th floor and gives you a little relief, and also provides some kind of a plaza or gap between the 2 buildings, kind of breaking down the mass. And this one breaks down the mass because it's got this rhythm of smaller buildings. So we're proposing that in a medium scale zone, that we would require some kind of facade articulation if your building exceeds 3 stories or 100 feet long, or 3,500 square feet of total facade area. So that would, we've got to work out the detail on this, but the idea is that a 3-story building, 100 feet long, that's a pretty small urban building. You don't really have to do anything to articulate that. But if you're bigger than that, you have to do something. So if you were a 4th-story building, you might articulate it by pushing that 4th story back. And so that's in place of that 3-story, 4-story step that I showed you earlier that I said we were reconsidering. We're saying that this might be the way to get at that. We might not require that you do that, though. You might also have an option to do an articulation like this by breaking up the mass of the building this way, or otherwise, in a kind of a different style breaking up. And this would be the same kind of application of this standard in the larger zone. And so why are we doing this? We think that we want to break up really big, long buildings with fairly uninteresting kind of plain facades. We think this could get you that step back if a developer wanted to choose that compared to this. But we think for the long buildings, this will help break up long masses so that we don't have as much. So we're proposing to do that and require that in all of these commercial mixed-use zones.
So I do a time check. We're a bit over,
Okay.
but
I can go through pretty quick.
yeah, well, and I think that there's good participation tonight, but we want to get the questions and then your report and command report and.
Can I get 5 more minutes?
Oh yes, unless there's any objections to.
Keep going.
Okay, that's all I
Keep
wanted to
going?
do.
Okay.
Time check.
We're talking about full block zoning transitions on large sites. So this is an illustration of one, happens to be in the Mississippi area. But you have them on 82nd is full of these things, full block zones where you have commercial all the way to the edge. You can imagine this being 82nd Avenue, this is 81st. That's not the situation, but that's the kind of situation I'm talking about. Right now you can build commercial all the way to the backside and you can put a blank wall essentially on the residential side. So what we're suggesting, and we don't know how well this is going to work, but is on the backside of the residential block requiring that the first 15 feet from the edge be in a residential use. Now 15 feet, that's a really schemy residential use. What the idea is that we're trying to drive, if somebody's going to redevelop the whole block, drive the residential development to the backside of the block so that they actually have commercial on the main street. They might have residential as well, obviously, but make sure that the transition here is more of a residential to residential transition rather than just the backside of a commercial building. If you're going to build a commercial building and just leave this the backside of a commercial building, you're going to have to set it back and landscape it or something. We're not going to just allow it to be a blank wall at that edge. So that's the idea with this one. We're talking about large sites and planned developments. This one has kind of been supported on our neighborhood walks. I don't know how you'll feel about it. We're saying on large sites like 2 acres or more. So in outer east, this would be a site like, or not outer east, but in central east, where would a 2 acre site be? Fred Meyer on Deason and 66th. There's my example for what. To allow larger or taller buildings on those sites to try to better meet our growth objectives in an area where it doesn't necessarily impact as many residents. You got a big site, you're not right up against neighbors in every situation. You could probably bury in the center of that site a 10-story building without having a huge impact on neighborhoods or views or whatever. I mean, traffic implications, we need to sort that kind of stuff out. But in terms of the building size, it's not so critical as long as we transition at the edges. At least that's what our thinking is pretty well. So we would build in a proposal that said that on a large site, you could build taller, you could build more, but you would have to do it in exchange for some kind of a land use review or a design review or a community benefit process. We wouldn't do it just by right. We'd say that you could, go larger and go bigger if you, again, went through some process to make them happen. Oops. We are talking about establishing different development standards based on kind of community characteristics or pattern areas. This is something that came out of the comp plan and the Portland plan, recognizing that inner Portland streetcar neighborhoods are quite different than neighborhoods in Cully or East Portland or Western Portland. They have different characteristics. And so we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but the idea here is that in inner neighborhoods like the Hollywood and the inner Southeast and whatever, we differentiate building coverage and landscaping requirements. So in inner Portland neighborhoods, we would continue to allow 90 to 100% lot coverage. You could build really substantial buildings in those areas with not much, if any, landscaping. And that's kind of a storefront pattern for many of our main streets. We try to, get landscaping through street trees and other amenities, but the sites don't have a lot of landscaping. And you continue that pattern for inner neighborhoods. For eastern and western neighborhoods, so anywhere east of 205, maybe Cully, maybe Brentwood, maybe parts of Lentz, and most of West Portland, maybe, but not Northwest, you would have maximum building coverages that are in the 75 to 85% range, so that you allow some area for landscaping, a required landscaping requirement. And we said on these civic corridors in outer neighborhoods or on really busy arterials, maybe like Outer Division or 122nd, some folks have argued for inner Powell, even, or Barber, requiring some kind of a 10-foot setback from that street to either landscape or some other treatment there that would be a buffer from the high volume traffic and the high speed traffic on those streets.
So essentially parking strip, like what we call parking strips in a residential area?
Yeah, well, this would be in addition to the 12 feet of sidewalk. So we typically require a 12-foot sidewalk measured from the curb, right? And then we would require those buildings on those busy streets to be set back another 10 feet or so.
So it would be on that side.
So you would landscape that area, you could plant trees or something like that. And the idea is that we don't want to, push buildings way back on the site, but we want to give a little bit more breathing room for pedestrians, and if you're going to have residential in those buildings, not have it right up on the street.
Would that include Sandy?
Probably not Sandy, because Sandy's in the inner pattern area, and one of the problems with Sandy is the lots, because they're triangular, are really difficult to develop. So if you take away 10 feet off of a lot on Sandy, you basically kill it, except for maybe for a house, or a really small scale development. A couple more things we're looking at. Street frontages. Sorry, I'm taking a long time. We're trying to improve the window coverage standards. Right now, we require 25% window area at the ground floor on these buildings. We're talking about in the key areas going up to 60%, and in the non-key areas up to 40%. We're also talking about treating residential differently. So if you're in a center, we want to require 60% because we really don't want to encourage residential at the ground floor in kind of the core areas. We want more commercial there. And in outer areas, we want to, not outer areas like East Portland, but outside of the centers, if we're going to allow residential, we want to try to make it good quality space. We'll still allow it at the street edge with a lower level of glazing, but you can have the option of setting it back or raising it as a stooped kind of arrangement. We're also talking about increasing the requirement for street frontage entries. This is required right now where you have one entry per use, but if you only have one use, you're only required to have one entrance. So we want to say the minimum frequency On corridors, it's 200, one for 200 feet, so that's one per block, not a very high standard, but some people have argued that that's too much. We're saying in centers that a minimum of 2 per block is what we would want to require. And centers are places like Hollywood, areas with the most activity. I won't go into setbacks, but suffice to say, we're trying to simplify that regulation. We're going to bring more buildings closer to the street, frankly, is the idea here, but provide more opportunities for this kind of a plaza by not requiring 100% of the building to be built by the street. So provide some opportunities for some setbacks in that, but bring the majority of the building close to the street and simplify the regulation. We want to explore, we've tested requiring some outdoor space for each residential unit in the building. The 48 square feet could be provided by a balcony or as a collective space or on the rooftop or potentially as a community room, but some kind of a collective or outdoor space. We're changing the side window requirements so that we can't have windows so close to the property line. If you're going to put residential units with windows there, you'd have to set it back a little bit. Going to limit the ability to build detached houses in center areas, so we want to have more substantial development so that we don't have these single dwelling forms being built in areas that are going to be critical in the future.
That looks awful.
That,
Pardon my opinion, that looks awful.
yeah, we don't want to see more of this kind of development happening because it really is
I hope.
it's an underutilization of pretty scarce resource in those areas. But there's always pushback on both sides of that equation. We've already talked about bonuses a little bit. We're going to try to improve the neighborhood notification requirements. We don't have any notification requirements for commercial development now. We do in multi-dwelling, so we're trying to at least bring it on par so that if you were having a development in a multi-dwelling area or in a commercial area, the neighborhoods, land use folks get notice of it, so you can at least comment on it, the developer would come out and meet with you. Ideally, we would do a two-step process where the developer comes and meets, neighborhood has an ability to have input, and then the developer comes back and says, here's how I either incorporate your input, or here's why I didn't incorporate your input, and here's what I'm proposing. It wouldn't be a process where the neighborhood could hold up a development, but it's an opportunity to have a conversation. And then finally, we want to enhance our exterior display area provisions to allow a little bit more flexibility there. It's a little bit tight right now. And we're looking at trying to address the parking situation through some shared parking regulations. Right now, most of our commercial zones don't allow that to happen. So we want to at least liberalize that to allow it to happen. So, sorry it took a while, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. Sure.
It appears, my understanding, that if a commercial area now has a general plan, comprehensive plan designation of mixed-use neighborhood, that the actual zoning could either go CM1 or CM2, and hasn't been decided yet. Now, I'm looking at your criteria here for zone application locational criteria, and the main criteria, at least listed here for CM2, is a broad range of locations with good transit service.
Yeah.
Can we assume that that means 7-day-a-week transit and not 5-day-a-week transit like we have now in Fremont?
That's a good question. Yeah, we haven't defined that yet, but that would be something we certainly want to consider. The challenge with Fremont, I'll be quite frank with you, is that since you have the CS right now in that area, our kind of working policy is we're not in the out of the box planning to downzone anybody. So on my current map probably shows CM2 on Fremont Street. But I think one could make an argument that because of transit service, it doesn't really meet the kind of criteria, and maybe there's an adjustment that could be made there. Certainly if we were converting a residential zone to a commercial zone at some point in time, we would look at that kind of criteria. We would probably come to the conclusion that you need to have good transit service to get the CM2. If you don't have it, you get the CM1. But I'm saying as a conversion, I'm not sure how that'll play out.
How do we make that argument?
Well, I think I'm hearing you make it. I'm not sure where we'll land with the conversion table. I don't know where Nan is on that, but that would be a conversation I think you're going to have with the DLs too. We're still working through these criteria. They're not firmed up yet, but that's something you're going to want to keep an eye on.
I see here, and then you're next, and I made it, yes.
Just a real quick commentary about the affordable housing. It's always a follow-up with me, affordable for whom. And when I asked about the median family income and it's 69 or 75, that is really high. You'd be lucky to find someone who can find a job. I mean, even though the job rate is down, everywhere you look in the economist is the value of the job per hour is still really low. So for us to base affordable housing on a certain percentage, but 69 or 75,000 per family of four, I think we're a little out of scale with that idea. So I think that's got to be modified with always affordable for whom we were looking at.
Well, and I guess my response to that is, we're at least trying to hit 60% of that level and provide some units at that level, so that ends up being around the 40,000 per family of four, 42,000. So that's pretty relatively affordable in the grand scheme of things. Bureau of Housing actually tries to hit lower targets, and that's where they really direct most of their funding, is to lower than 60%. So there's a gap in that 60 to 80% where developers of new projects are hitting markets that are much higher than that. I mean, the rents are really high.
Yeah, there's people who can afford that, but there is a significant populace that is lower than that, and so you always have to stay affordable. So I would really ask you to look at the lower scale too, because at $10 an hour, if you can find two people, one two-parent household, if you're lucky, both who are employed, if you're lucky, both making $10 an hour, that's only, and full-time, if you can find that, that's only $40,000 a year.
Yeah.
And then you've got childcare and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, no, we recognize that. When we did that, and I won't belabor this, but when we did our economic testing on it, if you just push affordability below that, there's just no way to make it happen effectively in the private market without some subsidies. So at least that's what we're seeing in the pro forma analysis, because of construction costs, because of land values, because of all kinds of stuff. Now, this proposal has been already, folks in the development community and out there have questioned, what will this do to land value? And the question is that the suspicion is that it might, for some markets, it's going to take a little bit off the top, because we're not allowing as much development as we do now by right. We're suppressing that. We're saying if you want to get back to that level, you have to do some. So there's a discount built into that. So it's a fine line between where we're trying to adjust. It's not completely free market. Right now it's a bit free market, but it's a free market based on the allowances we've given for development, right? So if we rein in those allowances, we're still adjusting market factors, right? And the market's going to take some time to adjust. So that's a long-winded explanation.
No, I agree.
I hear you on that.
So we're going to go in line with this, so go ahead.
Okay, I've got two comments. And in my neighborhood, Sandy, of course, is, and you know that because you live in my neighborhood. And I mentioned the other night when you presented this about the tunnel effect. But I picked up a couple of new things, seeing it again. And you talked about pattern area standards. And I think your areas are too broad. I think maybe, you may have one pattern area on Sandy and you may have another pattern area for Powell or Division or something like that. I think you have to look into that. The second thing, and I know this isn't part of it, but parking. You said 120,000 new households.
That's what they're projecting.
Okay, if that's the projection, based on the study that was done a year ago on parking standards, that would be 90,000 more automobiles. That's at about 75%. If you just take out downtown, figuring that there's nobody's going to buy a car downtown, that's still 45,000 more automobiles. You have to include parking. You have to talk about parking. You can't just pass it off. Whether the people drive their cars in the city or they just have to store them someplace, you still have to look at parking. And that is one of the besides the height, that is the biggest concern on parking. I mean, height and, on Sandy, parking and height are the two biggest concerns.
Thank you.
And
So I don't want to respond to that.
I'll respond really quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time. So parking, again, PBOT is looking at how we might manage on street parking. I'll be quite upfront. I mean, the city's strategy is that a lot of that supply is going to be met on street parking. And will there be impacts to, people adjacent to those main streets? Probably will be.
That's a livability issue.
Probably will be. I know it's a livability issue. We're all gonna experience some livability issues probably moving forward if we're trying to accommodate this. And I know Jim's gonna talk about growth management in the macro sense, so I'm waiting for that question. But I would say, I think the PBOT's looking at that. I'm not completely opposed to looking at new parking standards, but what we found when we do the development model is that the parking really starts to gobble up area pretty quick. And you start to rub into other things, and you can't have everything. If you have more parking, you have less development, then you spread it out more. So it's a trade-off. Yeah. But
So what's the process for giving input to PBOT on this parking issue?
You need to call PBOT, and the project manager is Grant Moorhead. And it's called the Centers and Corridors Parking Strategy. And I think he's out on parental leave for another week or two, but I'm sure if you called 823-4000, they could get you hooked up to his voicemail or his email account, and at least get hooked into when their committee meets and what they're looking at. But they're looking at, right now I know they're looking at 5 study areas to understand what happened with development happening. And I know one of the areas they're looking at specifically is interdivision, and they're looking like at a pre and post kind of situation and what the parking impact has been there and how that's working out. And we're also doing, connected to that, a survey of tenants of new buildings and doing some intercept surveys around those areas. And I'm just trying to understand more about people's new travel behavior. And are people driving into Division, for instance? And Division's not the only one, but are they driving into these areas, shopping? Are they local residents? How are they getting there? How are they moving around? How long are they staying? And what are the characteristics of car ownership and usage amongst apartment dwellers? And we're trying to do it anonymously so that if they do own a car or two or whatever, and they're parking it in front of your driveway, they could tell us anonymously, without, I'm being facetious here, but if they're parking it on the street, we want to know that.
I think that's a very important step.
Yeah.
Barbara, the next meeting of that group is April 30th. And it's
okay.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's right. You're on it.
Yeah, and it's 6 to 8, and it's down the Multnomah County building.
I have a question. There was some discussion about what the back of the building looks like, facing the neighborhood. I have some concerns about the sides look like a lot of times because, for example, the one apartment building that we already have, and we know we're going to get a few more, I'm Fremont.
Yeah.
The side is really ugly, and it's next to a one-story auto repair place, so the entire side is exposed, and it really looks cheap. Like, you stuck a nice front, I won't even say that's a nice front, but a front with some brick and stuff, pretending to look, fancy. And then the side is just, I don't know what those panels are that they use nowadays. They're like, large.
Party panels.
Yeah, and they look okay for about a year or two, and then you look at them on like MLK, on some of the buildings in MLK and stuff, and they're already beginning to deteriorate. But anyway, the sides, it's important too. It should be a visible. It's like when you, as a forester, if you design a clear cut, believe it or not, people actually do design clear cuts. You look at viewpoints. Where are you going to see that clear cut from? And I think that should be the same approach. What do people see?
That's a good point. We've been so preoccupied with trying to get a lot of these other things. That's come up before. The challenge with that, just quickly, is our zoning code allows buildings to be built, what we call it shoulder to shoulder, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to anticipate that there's going to be a building.
Right, you have that argument, but in that particular case on Fremont, the adjacent property is not big enough to build another large building. I guess it could be an extremely tall, skinny building.
Yeah,
but,
or they could consolidate properties.
Yeah, that's true.
But that doesn't mean that you can't do anything in the interim period. So we have talked about paint or design kind of things, but it can't be. It doesn't make sense to invest a ton of money inside of the building if it's going to be covered up by an adjacent one.
I understand that, and I'm sure that's thinking.
Yeah.
But
we've also talked about doing like some kind of green wall or something like that.
Right,
on those.
right.
And the problem with that is then you have adjacent property kind of implications. So we need to look at that more.
yeah, it certainly would be nice. I know don't want to get into the design, required design and stuff. But it strikes me that in Portland, the approach on the apartment buildings is to be, how many different textures can we use? And it'll be really attractive then, honestly, it's just so failed, most of it, And then there's a building going on at Fremont and 24th. I don't know what that building's going to be. It's not an apartment building. But I have to give them credit. They are doing a really nice brick facade on the front with, arched windows, and how the old brick would do the...
It's only 2-story, too.
Yeah, but you do the little, edging around the brick that curves around the window and stuff, just like an old style, and it's very attractive.
I should go look at that one.
Now, it has those hardy panels on the side, but...
Trying to think of what the name is.
Marty did it. I think she lives not too far from, it's on her route or something like that.
Okay, I gotta ask this question. With all this commercial coming in, I'm assuming it's residential above. We haven't said anything about that, whether it is or not. But the big question is, let me finish so we can get through tonight. Sure. What kind of commercial is going to come here, and what kind of wages are they going to pay? Because retail does not pay very well, and most ground floor businesses are retail. And in Roseway, we have storefronts that have been vacant for years, and even over a decade. So why are we working on building more commercial when we can't fill what we have?
Well, there's part of, so probably a long answer, but we don't have any ability to regulate, wage rates in those buildings. I mean, by and large, it's a private market kind of action. We have some commercial space that stays vacant for different reasons. I mean, it's not all because, there's not a demand for commercial space. Sometimes there's property interests that keep things vacant for different reasons. So I can't explain what's going on in some of those Roseway buildings, which I'm familiar with, that have been vacant for a long time. But, not all of the space that's at the ground floor in these buildings are going to be commercial. Our zoning code allows residential. So it might be residential at the ground floor. What we're trying to do is limit that residential at the ground floor in areas where we really want to have, good quality commercial space. So if a new building came in, 72nd and Sandy, Fremont is considered one of those center areas. So that's probably an area where we would want to say, if a new building came in, we want to require at least the ground floor of that building to be built to accommodate commercial in the future, so that you don't preclude the opportunity for that. Because the market currently may not be there for commercial space, but in 5 years, there may be a real robust market for commercial space in that area as the population increases or as traffic patterns change. So we don't want to preclude it. So that's kind of the only answer I can give you to that. We're not really adding commercial space. We're adding, we're rezoning the commercial space that we have now to allow better, I think, quality and try to manipulate the residential that's going on top of it in a better way. We've still got areas where all of these areas don't require residential either. We're not requiring that, so they could be, larger commercial office type buildings as well. But what we're seeing is that there's not much of a market for that outside of central areas. There's a little bit of office development happening on Williams at Fremont. There's a little bit that's happened in Hollywood because Providence is nearby. But by and large, it's not much. It's usually small scale office to the ground floor of a commercial building. I don't have a good answer for you.
But like the New Seasons building, where New Season is on Broadway.
Yeah.
Grant Park Village.
I can't remember how many stories it is.
Probably 4.
4.
Yeah.
But at the bottom, it's like New Seasons, and there's a pizza place, and there is a pet thing, and I mean, there's a lot of different businesses that have gone in on that main floor, and the residents are all above it. So I think that's what they're.
But like I'm saying, those ground floor retail establishments, the wages are piss poor. There's no better way to put it. If you make $10-12 an hour of those jobs, you're making good money.
Right, but that's.
And then you work on the ground floor, but you can't afford to live upstairs.
We did talk about some of that economics. I'll take a few questions.
Sandra,
around the room.
I know it's getting late on the time, and you weren't at the last meeting. I don't know that you were, but one of the things in the minutes, it should be in the minutes, that if we have to extend the meeting, we make a motion.
Yes, and
that's why I interrupted you.
So I did have, did you see me ask permission to ask a question?
You have permission to ask a question, yes, go ahead.
Okay. So the way I'm hearing this is we're talking about 120,000 new households. 85,000 of those will be in our existing neighborhoods and the streets that run through them. That's almost 1,000 new households per neighborhood. Do you appreciate what that's going to do to our existing neighborhoods? Beaumont's only 3,000 households in the whole neighborhood, and you're talking about adding another 1,000 on average. And also with 85,000 new households, you're going to have at least, 70,000 new cars, and not just parked in our neighborhoods, but driving on our streets, which are already at capacity. What are you going to do about that? And please don't tell me all these people are going to take transit, because transit has been losing market share for 100 years. And is currently, below 2 or 3%, except in the central city.
So, I don't have a great answer for the traffic issue. The numbers that you're throwing out there are probably about right, because I think that we're saying 50% of the households will go into the centers and corridors, and about 30% will, 20% will go into neighborhoods. So
now, wait a minute, corridors are part of our neighborhoods in anybody's world except the planet's world.
No, they're part of the neighborhoods. I mean,
yeah.
So you're going to get probably 70 of the 120 or 75 of the 120 over the 20-year period. And all I can tell you is that our model allocates where they think these households would go. And they're showing there are some areas where you're going to get more because the model allocates it to areas where either the market is very hot and the development economics support that. So inner southeast, for instance, seems to get a lot of development, and the Williams, Fremont, MLK kind of core area around interstate gets a lot of development, particularly that interstate corridor because there's a lot of capacity there. And the other place that seems to be, there's a target because it's zoned.
Are your tax abatements encouraging that development in those neighborhoods too?
There are tax abatements available for some of those, but the tax abatements are available even more broadly than that if there are things are right. What's ironic is that even though there are tax abatements available, the market since the crash or the recession of the last, when the market rebounded, there was enough profit in most of those developments that the developers have not taken advantage of the tax abatements that are out there. And I know you probably may not believe it, but I've got some evidence in our housing codes that confirm this.
Okay.
Just stumbled over on
They haven't taken advantage. The multi-tax abatement that's out there hasn't been used at all because there's enough, because the rents have risen enough in some of those areas that they don't need the tax abatements to make them pencil out anymore. They haven't used it.
So are there strings attached though to those tax abatements?
Yes.
Okay, there must be, or they wouldn't have
attached, affordability,
Yeah.
or any other kind of thing. So they haven't used them to build those. There was a project on Interstate, and don't quote me on this, but I'm not sure which one it is, but it came in initially as a tax abatement project and then ended up going completely market rate because they found that they didn't need it and that they could charge market rents.
So this doesn't sound like we're building much affordable housing.
No, so we're trying to, so that's part of the strategy here is to try to get a market mechanism that will do that, because if we continue to allow development at the levels that we're allowing it at, there's no reason to build affordable housing. There's nothing, the development allowances that we provided back in the 90s really allowed a very generous development envelope, and if the market conditions are there, there's really no incentive to provide any affordable housing without either a subsidy or a tax abatement or something like that, and even in those cases doesn't happen.
So I'm going to interrupt because it's past 8:30.
Sorry,
so,
you're taking a long time.
No.
Thanks for robust
but
questions.
We have been grappling with the issue of having some really interesting questions and presentations at our meetings, and our chair has stepped down, and so before we get into extending the meetings, what I can do to facilitate is just, ask everybody in the room. We have some other items on the agenda to get through, so we could decide to end the meeting on the time that we say we were going to end at 8:30, or those who want to make reports can stay longer. Or next month, we don't have a presenter, and maybe it's an opportunity to share as a group all of the things that are happening in the neighborhoods, because we have neighborhood reports. Why, thank you, Dave. Okay, so can we move on and just sort of vote on?
I'd like to continue hearing answers from the city.
Well, you can
I'm
do
sure
that with
well,
Barry at his office hour time.
I'm
but
sure
we
there's
have
a lot of other
meeting.
people here that still have questions.
Well, actually, as a facilitator, it's 8:30, and we've gone almost a half an hour over our agenda for this presentation. So I think Barry can pass out his cards and we can have that conversation. Or next month we can continue as a group to talk more about this mixed-use project amongst our neighborhoods. So you're welcome to come
But the
back.
important thing is the city's answers on this stuff, and the city's information.
Sure, and I think that you can exchange,
Well,
time to
my
talk.
question is, do you need a motion to extend the meeting to finish out the agenda?
So I put that on the.
Because I will make that motion if you.
And I'll second.
Okay. So do we continue on with our neighborhood reports, or do we go?
I'm going to hear
I'd
something.
like to continue. I'd like to amend the motion to continue with the neighborhood reports after we finish the Q&A.
No, that's not on the table.
It is, I just
I'm
made a motion to
facilitating the
amend.
meeting, thank you very much. So what's on the table right now is to continue the agenda. And then next month, we have that opportunity to have a more robust conversation.
We could come
So,
You're close by, Barry.
So Barry has offered to come back, so that's,
Ann comes to your meetings regularly, she's pretty adept at most of the questions.
and we
Can I-
also.
Can I amend the motion that the continuation of the meeting is only for the purpose of Dan Stark giving her report, and that the neighborhood reports can be sloughed off until next month?
Okay.
That's fine.
My report's very brief.
No, now you've got even more time to be brief.
So.
Thank you for,
Thank you, Barry.
you know how to get a hold of me or through Nan.
Thank you so much.
Sure, okay, thanks, Barry.
Sorry, I didn't put
Okay.
So it sounds like we were getting a report from Nan and then adjourning the meeting.
Main thing I want to let you know is another comp plan update. And today we tallied up all of the testimony that we received over the last several months, and as you know, it closed last Friday. We received 3,999 pieces of testimony, so one short of 4,000.
Holy mackerel.
There's probably a 4,000th one out there that we haven't run across yet. So anyway, thank you who testified. Your written and oral testimony counts in that. So I appreciate very much how much activism this group alone provided and really came forward. So that's wonderful. As far as how things are progressing, there is a hearing next Tuesday, and I can't give you the details on what the agendas are for these. I'm sorry, I called it a hearing. It's a work session. So these are all work sessions that the Planning and Sustainability Commission will be doing every 2 weeks, continuing that until what looks like early June. So they were planning to make a decision at the end of May, but it looks like they need to schedule in another session in order to go over some of the issues that they want to spend more time with. As you can imagine, it's really, really complicated, and a lot of issues have risen to the top in terms of importance, affordable housing being probably, as I see it at least, the number one issue. So just a lot to talk about there in terms of refining policies, making sure that everything's in there that that the testimony has requested, and also refining the maps, which is kind of secondary to the whole process. Really, the goal of the policy document is the biggest thing, but the mixed-use zone changes that are going to be on the maps, that's pretty huge. And then all of the individual requests that we had for small tweaks to the code. Sorry, my phone's ringing. So yeah, it's really comprehensive. That's an understatement for what it is. So the best way for you to track what the work sessions are, which, as you know, are open to the public, is to go to the BPS website, portlandoregon.gov/BPS, and you can get the Planning and Sustainability Commission agendas on there, because I didn't bring them with me today.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding both the comp plan and the transportation system plan, because I testified before the Planning Commission against the hierarchy of transportation. And in the transportation system plan, somebody from the city, and I don't remember the person's name, said that yes, it's being revised. The City Club had an issue with it. There's been other issues with it. I didn't talk to the person. I just heard the testimony. And I'm just wondering if you know where that's headed.
They had another work session on it their last meeting, and they're going to have another one, I think.
I'm specifically talking about the hierarchy part of it. Because that was an issue. It sounded like it was an issue with the City Club, and a big issue with me, and it was an issue, that the city brought forward to the Planning Commission. Somebody, a staff person did.
Yeah, I cannot answer that, Terry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry, when is that planning session, or that workshop?
So the next one is next Tuesday.
What's the time frame?
And they vary in times in order to accommodate different kinds of schedules. So next week it starts at 3, I believe, 3 or 3:30, and it goes till 9. They usually go 5 to 6 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. So sometimes they start at 12:30, sometimes they start at 3. I think it's 3:30. So just check the schedule. So that's mainly what I wanted to let you all know. Thank you again for all your participation and paying attention to it. And then the next thing to look forward to is that once they do make a decision, then there will be a draft coming out, a recommended draft, and the recommendation is to City Council. So there's going to be a whole new start of public process once it gets in the hands of City Council, and more opportunities to testify. The other thing that I'm going to be working on after that is the zoning map. So Barry alluded to that a little bit. So what we're putting out right now is the comprehensive plan map, and then we have to go in and put the zoning in. So again, it's going to be not significant changes, especially to the residential areas. So just like it was through the comp plan process, you're not seeing that big swaths of single-family residential areas are changing to anything but that. So a lot of the work is going to be around the mixed-use areas and what the appropriate corresponding zone is going to be. And I think Barry talked a little bit about the fact that while we're going to be kind of doing a broad brush of those areas, we're also going to be paying attention to specific situations like gas stations, for example. How are we going to treat those when they might be prohibited in the corresponding zone? So do we want to prohibit those and just turn all those into grandfathered situations, or do we want to treat them differently? Other kinds of situations like that that are more auto-oriented.
Comment on the gas stations and the auto places. You don't want to have to drive clear across town to get gas. You don't want to have to drive clear across town to get your car repaired. All that's going to do is add VATs.
Right, right. I'm with you there, and I think a lot of people are. So it's a little bit of a conundrum, and we'll see how it all falls out. But I'm going to be doing some outreach. In fact, I've got one date in May scheduled here at the office prior to our meeting, where people can come and talk to me about their thoughts on that. So I'll be out in the community for a couple of months,
And you'll email.
scheduling different
they're doing the outreach for that. I just haven't received. And when I do, I'll send it out to you.
Yeah. Okay.
We do have a room reserved. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sorry.
Yes, draft coming out.
Sometime in early to mid-June is what it looks like, yeah.
So, thank you all for being engaged in tonight's meeting. Please email me any thoughts for the next meeting. This is the first time right at this moment. Doesn't mean that's going to be the case 2 weeks from now or tomorrow. If I don't get a chance to say, can I present at your meeting? We have this initiative we need to get. So that can always happen, but in the meantime, if you have, a topic of discussion or something that you want to bring forth, please email me. Otherwise, we will focus on our neighborhood activities and discussion, and perhaps I can talk to Barry about coming back, since it's an ongoing, mixed use is ongoing. So to come back and have, from the presentation, more discussion. So, but feel free to email me with any thoughts, and we'll adjourn the meeting. And see you next time.
So, with the high rises, we're going to have to update our fire equipment to reach the high. Well,